Yes, so we'll start. First, in your archival collection, you have a lot of handwritten notes for each of the articles you wrote. Can you briefly explain what your writing process was? How did you come about to write?
Well, most of those papers are again speeches.
Okay.
And so I would probably sketch in general ideas and then gradually fill it in. I remember at one time having a big drawing pad and writing all over the drawing pad and then gradually organizing it. But I was not, whereas my thinking is very carefully constructed, I was not aware of being careful about that. You know, that's my natural predisposition, but I would have ideas scattered all over and then gradually bring them into some kind of framework, yeah.
Can you narrate, from your perspective, the Reconceptionalization movement? What are your thoughts about it after all these years?
Oh, you don't really want me to answer that, do you?
I do want you to answer that. And what do you think about your article and being part included in that book?
Well, oh damn.
Again, you can pass.
No, I'm all right. I'm all right with that. That's no problem. I need to think about. I'm not sure if it was my initial reaction, but it was a reaction that became solidified earlier. In that, whereas I appreciated the book in the fact that those essays, both of mine and of other people's, were brought together, I really think it was a profound mistake. The title was a profound mistake, and that points to the consistent problem that Bill has had until recently, but also that the field has had. Because it wasn't a matter of reconceptualization, it was indeed a matter of the history of the field being blocked and attending then to other traditions to open up the field. And by labeling it as a problem of reconceptualization, that freed everybody to play around with new ideas and to ignore the historical dimension of it. And I think Bill was a major contributor to that problem, which I don't think he was thinking about at that time, and he may be thinking about it now. But I remember bringing that to him earlier, and he wasn't overly responsive to of my critique at that time. I don't know whether he'd be responsive now or not. I know that he's more aware of the historical dimension. But I think it really set the field back because it legitimated where are the bright ideas rather than what are the history of the ideas that impact upon the field and what are the influences on that. And that then was also shown in some way by, who's the guy in Illinois that did the history, tried to deal with the history of curriculum field? I know his name well, and I know him. What he did was to look at the history of the field not as an intellectual history, but tracing out the patterns of people working with whom. And that too was a mistake because it ignored the intellectual dimensions of it and thought it was indeed a matter of mentors and passing on something. So there hasn't been... so I think it waylaid the attention to the history of the field that needed being done. Now, I felt all right about the collection, and both mine and Jim and Maxine's and whoever else was in there. I had no question about the collection. It was the labeling and the idea that there are reconceptualists rather than people who are concerned about the present field, its historical origins, and what trains of thought have been neglected and what trains of thought need to be brought in.
If the reconceptualization didn't happen, do you think the field would still be around today? Do you think it was necessary?
Well, Bill certainly has done a good job of bringing a variety of people together. I don't know if it's because of the reconceptualists or because of Bill's fluency in writing and his desire to organize things. But frankly, I think a lot of the reconceptualist stuff is nonsense. You know, I don't think it contributes. I think it has indeed legitimated people doing their own damn thing as a reconceptualist. So what it has done is to keep alive an interest in the field, but it has also, in many ways, distorted the field by fringy ideas. I have no idea what would happen if he hadn't done that. because he at least was in the movement associated with his annual meetings and so forth, did indeed keep the whole thing alive in some ways. But I'm not sure the curriculum field as a whole is any better off because of that, because we still have splintered groups. We have these extreme people on the left and the Steinberg Frary group, which is interesting, but hashing over the leftist argument differently than Mike does, but it isn't clarifying the basic structures of the field that I think I tried to lay out yesterday in some ways. So,
do you think there is hope in unifying the splinters? Or should that be our hope? Should that?
Well, I would go back to the thing I did. I think the curriculum field was dead long ago. And I trace it back to the 1930s, the problem back to the 1930s, which is the origin of the curriculum field in some ways, as it exists. And I lay the fault essentially on I forgot his first name, Caswell, the president of Teachers College. Because, before Caswell, and I don't know enough about the history of Teachers College, Caswell did the thing that I think has been most destructive in terms of the intellectual development of the field. He identified 4 divisions within Teachers College: the social historical foundations, the psychological foundations, the curriculum instruction area, and then the administrative function. The fact that he lumped supervision with curriculum rather than supervision as a function of administration was a profound error. And therefore, there were 5 divisions. The 5th was indeed the instructional areas: social studies, science, language. The separation of curriculum from the content areas was a mistake. The identification of curriculum development and supervision with curriculum rather than with administration. So that structure that started in the 30s has been extremely dysfunctional, and it has been reproduced in other universities around the country. I think based upon Caswell's in the 1930s at Teachers College. Now, I don't know if that has been explored historically. I think it needs to be explored historically, but I think that is the source of some of the problems, which I tried to address then in the Field is Dead bit, where I indeed talked about the return to content and that supervision needed to be elsewhere, which I still think is the case. But no, I don't think that exists any place in the country. I think the model from Teachers College was accepted in very many places. And I tried, when I was chairman of the Department of Curriculum Teaching, to try to bring back together again the administration and the supervisory aspects without any success, partially because of where I was in my own career and partially because of very little support within the institution and so on and so forth. And that's where I think Larry Kremen also made a mistake, in that he accepted that, and he should have been historically aware of the problem, and I don't think he was. And then when Larry retired and the second president or dean after him, I forgot his name, reorganized the college in even stranger ways. So we lack an institutional mechanism to reflect the problems within the field, I think. So.
Several of your presentations caused tension upon completion. I talked yesterday about caused tension. You were very blunt in some of your presentations.
Oh yeah.
So how do those events speak to who you are as an individual, as a person? How did you survive them, and where did you find the courage to say it? Some people were not so bold and so courageous in some aspect.
Well,
say such.
I wasn't very well accepted within the general field. I mean, let's face it. People didn't attend to what I was writing elsewhere. And like Elliot Eisner could ignore me. John Goodlad didn't pay much attention to me. Jim and I were by ourselves, so to speak. So we weren't well recognized within the field, and that's why we became in sort of a subset kind of thing. Didn't bother me because I was doing what I thought needed to be done. I wasn't concerned about the consequences. I was accepted by some of my colleagues at Teachers College and not accepted by others, which is probably why I wore down and gradually left the institution. It's not the only reason, but I wasn't thinking about the consequences. I was in the language of the people who write about prophecy. I was speaking what I saw as truth to power kind of thing. I spoke it as the way I saw it. And the fact that I was reading all these different orientations, I thought it was very important that they come back into the field. They weren't being brought in the philosophy department. The major philosopher after Phil and I were close, and Maxine and I were close, but the major trends within the philosophy department was in an analytic tradition under Jonas Saltus. And Maxine and I shared a lot of common doctoral students, and I have no idea what Maxine thought of my work. I never felt any disrespect. And Phil Phoenix appreciated what I was doing. His son wanted a degree in curriculum and teaching, and Phil said, "You have to study with Dwayne." So the fallout from that, the fallout in terms of the direction I took shows in terms of the way I went and the way the field went. I was pretty well ignored. And probably is still pretty well ignored by a hell of a lot of people. Yeah.
My question then is, at least by the multitude of presentations you did give and places you were invited to speak, it would push against that you were rejected or ignored by the field because you were speaking.
But I was usually invited by people who were not necessarily mainline people. That address to Division B of AERA was a result of, I want to say George Willis, but I have the feeling there was somebody else involved who was impressed with my work. And he was in a position of deciding who was going to be the speaker at that, and so that came out of that. My speaking of ASCD is that I had enough connections with ASCD people, Louise Berman being a case in point, who was, the executive secretary of ASCD for a while. And that came out of, again, the Alice Mile context, so to speak, because Alice was highly respected, and Alice had great respect for me. And I was active in ACEI, Association for Childhood Education International. And then, many of my last papers were done through Bill down at LSU, several of them. So, and the one on Heidegger didn't come out of Bill, it came out of Paul and people at Ohio State that knew me. So,
if you would do it all over again,
I'd do the same thing.
You wouldn't care about consequences?
No, I'm convinced that the field needed broadening out. And again, Herrick, although he wasn't thinking in that way, and he was training me in a sense to be an empiricist, he certainly supported the work I was doing. He had no question about that. So,
do you think it's a weakness of the field, people thinking about the consequences? Is that a weakness that's evident elsewhere, or is that?
I can't answer that. I have no idea. I don't know how other people thought. Certainly, I wasn't overwhelmed by. I had respect for Arno. I thought his focus was a little narrow, but he was doing it with integrity and a real commitment to integrity and to the solidity of his research, both empirically and historically in some ways. Alice was very supportive of me. The people in teacher education, Margaret Lindsay, Margaret knew me from Northern Illinois University, and whereas she didn't necessarily think the way I did, I never felt anything but respect from her. And Florence Stratemeyer, who retired early, not early, but reached her retirement age shortly after I was there, I also felt support. I basically felt support within the Department of Curriculum Teaching for the most part. I did not necessarily feel that from, Arnold got tired of me. He couldn't stand me after a while. And I didn't feel that from Ann Lieberman or Gary Griffin, but they were good lad students, and I can understand that. So.
Yesterday you discussed the role of the educator. And so not focusing on the distinction between schooling and education, can you provide any type of landscape of quote-unquote education that you are imagining when you say the word education? Whoa.
No, I can't.
Okay.
No, because I've worked with seminary professors and would-be seminary professors. I worked with elementary school teachers. Some work with secondary school teachers. I've seen education in religious settings and non-religious settings, and I don't think that I use the word educator as an ideal type. It becomes indeed almost a wastebasket category. You know, it's a way of pulling together a lot of different things and asking what they had in common. Well, I think I spelled that out to some extent in that little essay that I did on why be a teacher, kind of thing. That teachers are, whether you call them educators or not, are called by a variety, 3 or 4 different elements in the culture or elements in their lives and how they respond. I think the word educator simply becomes a broader category to put a lot of stuff into. So teachers are one category of educators, and there are other categories of educators, clearly. Robbie McClintock, I remember making a statement, politicians can also be seen as educators in some ways. And I remember making a connection between politics being sort of instantaneous education and education being slow politics. But, so, no, yeah, okay.
And then, does the notion of having an educational method or an educational approach speak to you? And if it does, then what does it mean to be educational in the academy? Never mind. What does it mean to be educational?
Well, I can't. I think you're going to need to reframe that last question. But let me. The search for method is a mistake, and Gadamer deals with that. It seems to me. True, we end up with methods, but it's a matter of how we think about what we're doing. And to the extent that we think in terms of methods, it's as if somebody else has identified what the educational process is and how to proceed in it, so we don't have to think about it. The crucial thing is thinking about what we're doing, and that may lead to a method, but the important thing is how we think about what we're doing. And that's what I have against much teacher education, including much the stuff in Christian education. People are looking for materials and methods, rather than asking, how do I think about this situation and what do I do in it? So I think that's an escape from real hard thinking, the search for methods. Now your second part of that question was what?
What is educational, or educational methods, or education?
Well, I think I dealt with that yesterday in terms of that which is education was that where some human being is confronted by something which they are not yet. coming to grips with one's sexuality is also coming to grips with a kind of otherness that needs to be integrated. So I prefer to deal with education in that way. And so coming up against the symbol system of arithmetic or geometry invites you to a new realm, a new way of being, new tools, new ways of thinking. And which I didn't necessarily articulate yesterday, one way of looking at content in the schools or in formal educational environments is that content in a setting is a gift from an older person to a younger person or to a neophyte. And content, it seems to me, is a gift-giving kind of thing that needs to be attended to, rather than a requirement that we are placing upon kids. It's a matter of, are they able to accept our gifts, so to speak. It's tied to that whole process. I don't think I'd try to simplify it any other way.
The gift, how can we give the gift without distorting it into a mandate?
That's a political problem. It's not an educational problem. The effort to shape behavior or to socialize people is an aspect of political life. People who want to maintain their culture and their way of being come hell or high water, and one of the reasons that is seen in a mandate in the educational institutions is that people in charge of the educational institutions are afraid of having their way of living questioned and brought under question. It is indeed the emperor's new clothes phenomenon. People are afraid of having kids question them. And the way to prevent that is to socialize them into an accepted way of thinking, which goes back to this whole economic interest that I have. That is also, it seems to me, a control mechanism. You don't want to raise questions about the social economic order, and the way to do that is to say you don't know a damn thing about economics. But that's a political problem. It needs to be named as such. And parents are afraid of kids, in part because they're afraid of conversation, and you've had that yourself. You know what it's like, and that's true. I'll never forget Tom Groom used to come over to our house, our apartment, when he was a student, and Morley at that time was 2, something like that. In her really good phase of being, no. And she was in the high chair, and I was suggesting, she would say, oh, and I know, I was trying to put the bib on her. She said, no. And Tom, in some other meeting, said, I wish I had the courage to say no to you, to Huebner, like his daughter does. That was so revealing.
To a different area, what's your interest, or do you have any thoughts on the growth of religious study departments throughout the academy versus theological departments? And what's
No, I haven't thought in that realm, but the religious studies department are clearly they indeed attempt to deal with religious phenomena in a more or less objective view, without necessarily dealing with the shaping of commitments. Whereas in divinity schools, there is a real commitment, in a sense, to traditions, which at a place like Duke is difficult because the traditions are many, but they are clearly all within the Christian tradition domain. Whereas the religious studies here deals with Hinduism, Buddhism, Hebrew, Jewish studies, Christian studies, biblical studies from a non-confessional point of view, so on and so forth. which I think is legitimate. I don't have any question about that. And I can understand why liberal arts colleges would not want to bring in anything from a confessional point of view. They would want to deal intellectually, and rightfully so, I think, because liberal arts institutions are not basically confessional organizations, nor should they be controlled by them, as far as I'm concerned. Although I grant that some liberal arts colleges run by religious denominations do want to push their confessional orientation. Sometimes to their benefit and sometimes to their loss, I think. So, yeah.
Would you ever work for a religious studies department?
No,
Why
never, no.
Why not?
I've never been invited, and I don't see religion as my major. I don't have the intellectual credits or ability to do that. I'm simply not that open. I mean, I don't have that kind of background. I clearly have encouraged people to read in a variety of fields. I didn't have any questions of using Heschel or some Buddhism in my curriculum courses, but that's because I thought Heschel shed light on the human relationships, and not because I believe Judaism was a crucial factor of life in any shape or form. So,
how has your philosophy of education been influenced by your philosophy of religion and vice versa?
I don't think I can deal with that question. I'm not sure that I make a distinction between those two. They're ways, both are ways of viewing one's role in the world and reflecting upon one's life and reflecting upon the world. And they're two different strands of reflection, it seems to me. Sometimes they mesh and sometimes they don't. You're dealing with clearly established both intellectual and social conventions that are different. And the fact that they become intertwined at some point doesn't mean that the distinctions don't exist. So, in the philosophers I read, John McMurray was indeed a Christian who was a socialist. I used to read Kierkegaard, both philosophically and when I was in sort of a spiritual, religious frame of mind, I would read him from that perspective. But I don't make a distinction between those. There is a distinction, but I don't think it's born in my experience of why I read particular things. I read things for the meaning, both in terms of my view of the world and myself, and how I can use that as I try to influence other educators or teachers.
When you read your work, one could argue that there is not much explicit theology being discussed, but implicit. How much should the reader be reading between the lines to your own theology? In essence, do you think one could adequately understand your theology through your work?
Would you think I have a theology?
Theology/philosophy. Whenever you talk about the transcendent and so forth, one could argue that it's a theological claim whenever you talk about.
Well, I could also be making a philosophical claim on that in some ways.
But wouldn't Tillich say that philosophy and theology?
I wouldn't disagree with that. My early work was not necessarily informed by any kind of interest. That's not true. I would hope that people would not look for religious or philosophical claims, but because I was speaking basically to educators, whether it helped them see what they were doing in a more significant, powerful way. I think I was trying to address the problems that teachers and other educators had. I don't think I was trying to key them into any either theological or philosophical position. Granted that in my later work they probably couldn't adequately understand or interpret it unless they also sort of picked up a philosophical, theological point of view, but that was not my intent. My intent I think my intent throughout my career has been try to make the educational process, the teaching process, or from the student point of view, their process, intelligible. I think that has been my intent all the way along. Recognizing that current structures of educational and curricular thought are, for most teachers, a form of false consciousness. And that we need to make teachers aware of what the hell they were doing, both in terms of the way they influenced other people, but also in terms of their own commitments and what they were doing. And the amount of false consciousness among teachers is absurd. They're not aware of what they're doing very frequently. They're not aware how they are being coerced into following somebody else's stuff. They get worn out because they are not authentic. And the crucial thing is to help them become authentic in terms of choosing what they're doing rather than unaware of doing something that others are, in a sense, demanding of them.
Do you worry that puts too much faith into the teacher? I mean,
No, I don't have any worry about that. I grant that at the current time it's a problem, but that's a breakdown also of it's a breakdown of a variety of things. It's a breakdown of teachers' unions, if there are such things. It's also a breakdown, in a sense, in terms of the administrative structure of schools. The fact that teachers are put into classrooms and the doors are closed, and they don't have time to talk to other people, is a political economic control of their intellectual imagination. The focus on team teaching, which was going on at one time, was pretty well broken up, it seems to me, and that also was a political control to make sure that teachers didn't work together. And in the college classrooms, that's the same thing. Teachers too infrequently do not work together. Now they do. My wife does it more than anyone else, in fact. But the isolation of teachers is one of the vehicles by which, I don't like the expression, the people in control maintain control over what's happening in schools. And I fault partially the teachers' unions for that back in the 30s and 40s, because they were more interested in their own welfare than they were in their intellectual development and in their social commitments. Now that wasn't always true, because in the early phases of the teacher union movement, particularly at Teachers College in New York City, one of my colleagues, Roma Gans, was very involved in that movement, and she was very much focusing in on trying to make teachers conscious of what they were doing. She offered a course called The Work of the Teacher, and one of the things that she did to really focus on that, both in terms of personal lives, social organizations, but then every year that she taught the course, they would take a night and they would spend the whole night touring the city, going to the fish markets in the morning, going to the evening courts, and then dealing with things. And she would rejoice when two members of the class would get engaged. It was but that was back in the 50s. She retired sometime in the 60s. But there was a strong movement with Counts and Roma and a variety of other people on teacher unions, not as a self-gratifying organization, except to protect them from the political forces, but also awareness of what they were doing and responsibility for what they were doing. And I do fault the teachers' unions for what's happening because of their self-centeredness in terms of their welfare rather than the welfare of what they were doing and the kids that they were working with. Now, Mike has tried to correct that. Mike has clearly focused upon the importance of democracy in schools. Do
you think unions are needed?
Yeah. And Bill does not attend to that enough. Bill has indeed individualized, which is perfectly okay, but he doesn't focus in on the corporate structure of teachers' lives. Or at least I'm not aware that he does. Now I know Freire and other people would do, and so within the strain of thought that he's involved in, there are people who do. But
So you seem to have very high expectations with other scholars' work and with your own work.
you mean other scholars in the field of education?
Right, yes.
Yeah, I
Where does that
don't.
originate? Where is this high expectations for scholarship? I mean, you talked this weekend a lot of things about what you do like, but you also referenced many things that you don't like.
Well, I have, for one thing, my education at the University of Chicago was at a really exciting time. And that's when the first curriculum theory meeting was ever held. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but I know that it happened while I was there. And I have great respect for the intellectual integrity of the people who were working there. Virgil Herrick was a guy of great integrity. He wasn't going in the direction that Jim and I ended up going, but he clearly supported us, and he was clearly interested in the curriculum field as an intellectually coherent field. And he didn't deal with a lot of pap. The literature at that time wasn't that interesting, but he at least had us compare Florence Stratemeyer with Smith, Stanley, and Shores, and so on and so forth, and ask about why and how to think about it and things of that kind. So there was a lot of focus upon not necessarily rigor, but at least some kind of coherent thinking about the curriculum field. And I think that's where both Jim and I became interested in how do we think about the curriculum field. It's because I think we were supported in that by Verge and his, the people that he drew around him in some ways. And Krug, with his focus upon history, also, I think, tried to make some sense out of the curriculum field in a different way than Herrick did. But who's the other fellow at Wisconsin in history that I've just forgotten? Klebart followed through on both followed through on Krug and followed through on Arno in terms of kind of intellectual respectability. Arno was certainly no schmo when it comes to a kind of rigor. I think he was limited in terms of his orientation, but I had nothing but respect for his commitment to bring analytic philosophy to the study of teaching. So that was not true of other people in the department, partially because Mackenzie and Lawler were more concerned about supervision and improvement and were less concerned about the intellectual dimensions of it. Alice was a really creative person in terms of what she did, and whereas she didn't approach it in the way that I did, she was also interested in trying to find better ways of understanding the educational process. So I don't know whether that was true of other institutions or not. I have no idea. I simply wasn't aware. When I was at DeKalb, Northern Illinois, the effort there was not to develop new creative ways of thinking, but rather to find new creative patterns of teacher education, which is a different kind of creativity and a different kind of rigor. But it wasn't a matter of the conceptual systems that were brought to bear so much as what are the new organizational patterns that need to be brought to bear. So.
There have also been a few times when you voiced disappointment in how others have used your work. Would you prefer people to stop referring to you
no.
because they don't use it as you intend?
I don't care how they use it. The work is out there. I don't care how they use it. That's their problem, not mine.
And how would you like to see, what are some of the biggest issues you have found when others reference to you?
I don't think I pay that much attention to it. I have no idea how people have attended to my work. I know that my work is ignored by a lot of people, but that's their problem.
Do you resent that?
Do I what?
resent that?
No. No. That's not an academic way of proceeding. I did what I could do, and if people can't use it, that's both my problem and their problem. But let's not conflate the two. Yeah. Part of it, I regret that I didn't write in such a way and did not write easily enough that I could address indeed the problems. That's one of the reactions I've had. In fact, I'm sorry that I hated to read their stuff rather than being responsible in offering a legitimate critique of their stuff. I did not do that. I didn't have the skill for it, and I didn't think it was worth my time. I wish I had had the skill for it, because I think I would have made more of an impact when stuff came out that I didn't like if I had offered us a really careful critique of it. But I never did that. That was not my that was forte, so to speak. And I regret in the fact that that I've never really responded to either Mike or to Bill with a good written criticism of their work. In part because I think their work is important, even though I think part of it misses, some things. But both of them have done important work in different ways. And I regret that they don't get together, but that's that's their problem too. So I don't know what other people in the field think of my work. I have no idea. I know it's not used very much, or at least it wasn't at one time. I don't know about now.
I think there's a research of it.
Yeah, I have no idea. I've been out of it long enough that I've been away from that field since 1982, which is 32 years. I have no idea what's happened. So.
You've also alluded a couple times yesterday at least, the importance, the role of students played in your professional life, students. How do you see that relationship with your students? Obviously, Michael.
Well, I think a good doctoral student indeed helps educate the professor and helps in the teacher's own growth. That was certainly true of Mike. I think Mike, Mike started out in the Department of Philosophy at Teachers College. And when he talked about what he wanted to do, I don't know if Jonas may have sent him to me, but someone said, "You don't want to work with me, you want to work with Dwayne." And when Mike said, "Can I go take courses over at Columbia in philosophy?" I said, "By all means." He did that. And I think it was partially that work that led me more directly into I'm mixed in terms of origins there. I know he was really reading Schutz at that time. Whether he introduced me to Schutz or I introduced it to him, I don't know. I think he probably introduced it to me. And I think it's out of that connection that I became involved with Habermas and the Habermasian stuff. I'm not sure that Mike was responsible for that, but it came out of that connection. And I think if Mike had not been in my life, I probably would not have moved in that direction as clearly as I did. And likewise, the fact that I was working with religious educators in both the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition, I became more and more interested in some of their streams of thought. Not that they introduced me to anything new, although Tom helped me become more familiar with the history of Christian education. But he did not help me in terms of my theological awareness, except as he was working on his, the stuff he was doing was indeed very sort of Habermasian in its mode, and that came out of his work with Bev Harrison at Union, and Bev and I were somewhat close in terms of our thinking about things. So I think good students are crucial. That was one of the reasons I left Teachers College. I was no longer getting good students. And I don't think that was because they weren't attracted to me. I just think that in our department, that was no longer a valued way of working, and they wouldn't bring in enough students to finance what they needed to do, and money became the crucial thing. It was an economic problem in some ways. And we didn't have scholarship money to bring in special people, so to speak. And I don't think Teachers College had a strong, I think it had a strong practical orientation, but not necessarily a strong theoretical foundation for recognition, particularly as philosophy and the social science, sociology took second place. And they had some strong work in anthropology, but I think the reason that was strong in anthropology is because it provided a field orientation for looking at what was going on in classes and schools. Not because of the conceptual power of it, but the research power of it.
You briefly mentioned that a good student is one that teaches you as well. Is there any other qualities that make a good student that was lacking in your students that you wish more of your students would have?
No, I don't think I can talk to that problem. I don't think I would think that way. I would certainly want people who were conscientious and committed, but I don't think I would think in terms of what they're, and honest, I don't have any question about that. I don't want to mess around with people who are, not trustworthy. But I see those indeed as part of the intellectual virtues, I guess, rather than something else. Yeah.
Whenever the students that you had were not bringing life to you and motivating you, how did you? Ultimately, you responded by leaving the field and so forth.
Well, I would try to help. I would try to help them with their work. I remember one guy that was an administrator and wanted a degree with me, and I helped him along. He didn't necessarily excite me, but I felt responsibility to help him do a reasonable piece of work. And I think that's true of other people that I worked with too. Many of the people in religious education, not many of them, but several in religious education, weren't at all interested in my ideas. And I'm sorry they weren't, but I supported them in terms of what they were trying to do and the way they ended up. And an example of that is Barry Jackson at Pittsburgh, who I saw. Ellen was invited there to speak last year, and Barry was dean, so I wrote to Barry and told him I was coming. So he went out of his way to really, he did his own thing, and he wasn't interested in my more philosophical, theological orientation. He was much more interested in the problems within Presbyterian church organization and teaching or educational strategies. So he went on to become, a professor of religious education, I think at Pittsburgh, and then eventually became academic dean. Apparently he's one of the best academic deans they've had there. And we spent a good 2 days where he was really very, very warm and gracious and took me around and let work pile up in his dean's office. And this New Year's, I got a little letter from him saying that he was aware that he didn't necessarily respond to what I was doing, but he now appreciates all that he has learned from me, so to speak. It's that the rewards of an educator sometimes are 20, 30 years away. Yeah.
Do you hear often from your students?
No, not anymore. I've been, away from doctoral students in a long time. And I mentioned why Tom and I no longer have as much close relationship. Mike and I don't have as much close relationship anymore either. But that's 40 years ago, 50 years ago almost, 40 years ago. So can't expect that.
Whenever you provided support to people, to students, and your interest didn't necessarily align, did it feel inauthentic to you? Just trying to support them?
No, because that was indeed part of the expectation of Teachers College. So that was a cultural norm. And Teachers College in those early years, and once Kieran became more of a force, it shifted. Teachers College in the early years was indeed a professional school rather than an academic school, and I worked in that situation willingly, knowing that I didn't have very many doctoral students, as many as Some people had 20 doctoral students, or something like that. It was outrageous. But again, that was the norm of the institution. So I was sort of delighted that I had so damn many students doing work that I wasn't interested in helping with. It didn't bother me. But I didn't feel any judgment by anybody in that at all.
Do you remember the maximum number of students you've had at one time?
No, I don't. I sent on to Bill the history of the Curriculum and Teaching Department's doctoral students, which ends probably in the 70s, so it doesn't deal with later years. And you can go through that and identify. I was one of the, I had perhaps the lowest number of advisees as anybody. No. I was hard. Mike first came to me and said he was interested, and I gave him a list of 15 or 20 books and said, go ahead and read these and come back, and most people wouldn't take that.